Alright, you guys, it's Elevated coming in a month late. So much stuff has been happening within this past month. It's been ridiculous. Anyways, that's not an excuse. That's just an explanation of the facts, I guess. There is no excuse for being this late on all this shit. Especially when I had all of this done. Like, I could have gotten all this done before my Christmas vacation, but I got too ahead of myself. I thought I was like, okay, I got everything done. I can do this on vacation, and then ended up not doing anything on vacation. And then when I came back to work, had a lot of work going on. That's a whole nother thing. Anyways, jumping right in, I do have, I've decided, because I said at the beginning of my channel I would do this for a year, do like a couple videos every month for a year. I decided to go ahead and make that a baker's dozen. So we'll get a January set of videos. Actually, I think I'll consider... No. We'll get a January set of videos too. So yeah, going right into it. Where we left off was the sexual copes, romance, and Freud's little slip up there that he had. Which is fine. I think it's really funny. I had to change the name from the name of the video because I guess I was getting so many views on it relative compared to my other videos. But just because I had the word sex in the title, like, Jesus Christ. People are so fucking ridiculous. So yeah, I changed it from sex to fornication, I think, or something like that. So hopefully that cuts off the people trying to look for other stuff on YouTube, whatever. That's so stupid. Anyways, so yeah, we're jumping into Kierkegaard on copes. Basically what he does is he pretty much rips up a lot of different groups of people and a lot of different like coping mechanisms that they have. And then we're also going to finish up. There's another section at the end, which I think is on neuroticism. So we'll take a look at that as well. So yeah, Kierkegaard, let's go. Kierkegaard gives us some portrait sketches of the styles of denying possibility or the lies of character, which is the same thing. He's intent on describing what we call today inauthentic men who avoid developing their own uniqueness. They follow out the styles of automatic and uncritical living in which they were conditioned as children. They are inauthentic in that they do not belong to themselves, are not their own person, do not act from their own center, do not see reality on its terms. They are the one-dimensional men, totally immersed in the fictional games being played in their society, unable to transcend their social conditioning. The corporation men in the West, the bureaucrats in the East, the tribal man locked up in tradition. Man everywhere who doesn't understand what it means to think for himself and who, if he did, would shrink back at the idea of such audacity and exposure. I have... Like, I'm ashamed to, like, put this, like, title on people, but, like, there are... like one-dimensional, two-dimensional people, and I don't know, man. It's just sad to see. Let's continue. Life sucks us up into standardized activities. The social hero system into which we are born marks out paths for heroism. Paths to which we conform, to which we shape ourselves so that we can please others, become what they expect us to be. And instead of working our inner secrets, we gradually cover it over and forget it, while we become purely external men, playing successfully the standardized hero game into which we happen to fall by accident, by family connection, by reflex patriotism, or by the simple need to eat and the urge to procreate. Kierkegaard gives us a description of the immediate man, his self, or he himself is a something included along with the other in the compass of the temporal and the worldly. Thus, the self coheres immediately with the other, wishing, desiring, enjoying, etc. But passively, he manages to imitate the other men, noting how they manage to live, and so he too lives after a sort. In Christendom, he too is a Christian, goes to church every Sunday, hears and understands the parson, yea, they understand one another. He dies. The parson introduces him into eternity for the price of $10. But a self he was not, and a self he did not become. For the immediate man does not recognize his self. He recognizes himself only by his dress. He recognizes that he has a self only by externals. Be very careful. As he says, he recognizes himself only by his dress, only by his externals. Be very careful what you recognize as yourself. Because if you sit there and you're like, oh, I'm... Like, what am I thinking of? The stupid ass fucking, oh, I'm just a man, I can't control my sexual urges. Like, that's a self-limiting thing. Like, you're imposing that limitation on yourself. Like, yes, you absolutely can control your shit. Like, you just choose not to. You fall into you only recognize yourself as a weak man, actually, is what I wouldn't even, if you can't, yeah, anyways, whatever. Let me stop. That's funny. Okay. So this is a perfect description of the automatic cultural man. Man as confined by culture, a slave to it, who imagines that he has an identity if he pays his insurance premium, that he has control of his life if he guns his sports car or works his electric toothbrush. Today, the inauthentic or immediate men are familiar types, after decades of Marxist and existentialist analysis of man's slavery to his social system. But in Kierkegaard's time, it must have been a shock to be a modern European city dweller and be considered a Philistine at the same time. For Kierkegaard, Philistinism was triviality, man lulled by the daily routines of his society, content with the satisfactions that it offers him. In today's world, the car, the shopping center, the 2-week summer vacation. Man is protected by the secure and limited alternatives his society offers him, and if he does not look up from his path, he can live out his life with a certain dull security. Devoid of imagination, as a Philistine always is, he lives in a certain trivial province of experience as to how things go, what is possible, what usually occurs. Philistinism tranquilizes itself in the trivial. This is part of the reason why I have such a thing against... And it's so cliche, too, being that typical, like, nerdy dude who doesn't like sports. But, like, I mean, there are certain sports that I do enjoy watching. Rock climbing, for one. That's a very good... I'm going off track here. Anyways, football, of course, is the main one. Because everybody worships it so much in America. And especially in Texas, where I'm at. Where it's like, it's just... Like, it's triviality, and it's like the amount of like, even like the smart people, like 2 of my siblings, they are both highly intelligent as well, but they spend so much of their like mental real estate on useless facts about like all the statistics on all the players, and they do the fantasy football and this and that, and it's just like, I don't know. It's like he says, tranquilizing yourself in the trivial. But yeah. That does remind me of, at the beginning, in my preface, when I said, what was that thing? Something about, like, if a man chooses to serve a god without thinking about his own benefits, then he is a slave to it or something like that. Basically, like, yeah, if you're like, it's one thing if you're like studying football and like using it as a hobby to like hone your like mental capacities, but if you're just doing it for the entertainment value and there's no like higher level like spiritual reason for doing it, then you're worshiping a god and like giving it, you know, full reign over you, basically. Because how often do people freak out over football? Like how emotional they get, and I love that they're always like, oh, it's just good fun and we don't mean it. And it's like, no, you like actually treat other people from different teams that you don't like, you treat them differently and like negatively and this and that. And it's like it's during the game you go through waves of highs and lows and anger over like, oh, I can't believe they didn't call that penalty or whatever the fuck they do. I don't know. Like it's a fucking, man, it's it it really does like take over you. This fucking dude with his big ass truck. I hate living in Texas sometimes. Anyways. Why does man accept to live a trivial life? Because of the danger of a full horizon of experience, of course. This is the deeper motivation of Philistinism, that it celebrates the triumph over possibility over freedom. Philistinism knows its real enemy. Freedom is dangerous. If you follow it too willingly, it threatens to pull you into the air. If you give it up too wholly, you become a prisoner of necessity. The safest thing is to toe the mark of what is socially possible. But Philistinism spiritlessly celebrates its triumph, imagines itself to be the master, does not take note that precisely thereby it has taken itself captive to the slave of spiritlessness, and to be the most pitiful of all things. In other words, Philistinism is what we would call normal neurosis. Most men figure out how to live safely within the probabilities of a given set of social rules. The Philistine trusts that by keeping himself at a low level of personal intensity, he can avoid being pulled off balance by experience. Philistinism works, as Kierkegaard said, by tranquilizing itself with the trivial. We just saw that last time too. I would also say another factor of this is learned helplessness, where it's like people don't, if you fail to teach someone like critical thinking and these higher modes of thinking, they have this it's called learned helplessness, where it's like they're used to being given answers, so when it comes to like actually looking for an answer themselves, they have trouble like even recognizing what could possibly be an answer. So in that way, like people like just basically like learning about like what to do as a job, a lot of people are like so limited to like, oh yeah, I worked in retail, oh yeah, I worked in restaurants, oh yeah, I worked in warehouses. Like that's a vast majority of the people I know, and it's like there's so many different opportunities for even like entry-level jobs like you could have gotten into, but like people are so limited by towing the mark of what is socially possible, as he says. Like just like yeah, it is what it is. Kierkegaard is painting for us a broad and incredibly rich portrait of types of human failure, ways in which man succumbs to and is beaten by life and the world. Beaten because he fails to face up to the existential truth of his situation, the truth that he is an inner symbolic self, which signifies a certain freedom, and that he is bound by a finite body, which limits that freedom. The attempt to ignore either aspect of man's situation, to repress possibility or to deny necessity, means that man will live a lie, fail to realize his true nature, be the most pitiful of all things. While one sort of despair plunges wildly into the infinite and loses itself, a second sort permits itself, as it were, to be defrauded by the others. By seeing the multitude of men about it, by getting engaged in all sorts of worldly affairs, by becoming wise about how things go in this world, such a man forgets himself, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too venturesome a thing to be himself. Far easier and safer to be like the others, to become an imitation, a number, a cipher in the crowd. Too much possibility is the attempt by the person to overvalue the powers of the symbolic self. It reflects the attempt to exaggerate one half of the human dualism at the expense of the other. And so the person becomes sick by plunging into the limitless. The symbolic self becomes fantastic, as it does in schizophrenia, when it splits away from the body, from a dependable grounding in real experience in the everyday world. The full-blown schizophrenic is abstract, ethereal, unreal. He billows out of the earthly categories of space and time, floats out of his body, dwells in an eternal now, is not subject to death and destruction. He has vanquished these in his fantasy, or perhaps better, in the actual fact that he has quit his body, renounced its limitations. This is something I mentioned in the preface as well, where it's like this book was written in the 70s, and psychology has advanced since then. I think a lot of the times when he talks about schizophrenia, I think another valid thing that he could be talking about is and I forget the name of the actual disorder, but it's the Secret Life of Walter Smitty, the Walter Smitty disease or whatever it's called. The where you're too wrapped up in imagination and escaping into daydreaming fantasy or something like that. But basically sometimes when he talks about schizophrenia, it could be more of that. That's disorder and not schizophrenia. It could be other stuff as well, but like I said, this was written in the 70s. I think schizophrenia was an umbrella term used for a lot of things that they didn't have delineations for that they do now, so yeah. Depressive psychosis is the extreme on the continuum of too much necessity, that is, too much finitude, too much limitation by the body and the behaviors of the person in the real world, and not enough freedom of the inner self, of inner symbolic possibility. This is how we understand depressive psychosis today, as a bogging down in the demands of others, family, job, the narrow horizon of daily duties. In such a bogging down, the individual does not feel or see that he has alternatives, cannot imagine any choices or alternative ways of life, cannot release himself from the network of obligations, even though these obligations no longer give him a sense of self-esteem, of primary value, of being a heroic contributor to world life, even by doing his daily family and job duties. Yeah. As I said, that learned helplessness. I do know when you are depressed, a lot of your higher mental faculties are limited as well. So even if you are normally in a situation able to think up or think on that higher level and be able to see possibilities and stuff like that, if you are in a depressive state, that's probably not as your ability to do that is probably hindered. But then he talks about this is all going back. I think we did this in part 1 where we touched on this as well. That one guy who commented about his brother who said he had to be careful because at times he would miss depression, miss the sadness, miss the guilt and all this and that. And this slide is what they're talking about. So yeah. Why would a person prefer the accusations of guilt, unworthiness, ineptitude, even dishonor and betrayal, to real possibility? This may not seem to be the choice, but it is. Complete self-effacement, surrender to the others, disavowal of any personal dignity, on the one hand, and freedom and independence, movement away from others, extrication of oneself from the binding links of family and social duties, on the other hand. This is the choice that the depressed person actually faces and that he avoids partly by his guilty self-accusation. The answer is not far to seek. The depressed person avoids the possibility of independence and more life precisely because these are what threaten him with destruction and death. He holds on to the people who have enslaved him in a network of crushing obligations, belittling interaction, precisely because these people are his shelter, his strength, his protection against the world. Like most everyone else, the depressed person is a coward who will not stand alone on his own center, who cannot draw from within himself the necessary strength to face up to life. So he embeds himself in others. He is sheltered by the necessary and willingly accepts it. But now his tragedy is plain to see. His necessity has become trivial, and so his slavish, dependent, depersonalized life has lost its meaning. It is frightening to be in such a bind. One chooses slavery because it is safe and meaningful. Then one loses the meaning of it, but fears to move out of it. One has literally died to life, but must remain physically in this world. And thus the torture of depressive psychosis, to remain steeped in one's failure and yet to justify it, to continue to draw a sense of worthwhileness out of it. And I think another factor of this as well was another thing we brought up in the preface. The bias of not buyer's remorse, what's the other one? Where you put in more effort into something so you value it more highly. Like this person probably put in a lot of effort into well, he calls it slavery. That's kind of harsh, but that like the being depressed and being like dependent on others like it used to give you meaning because it's like well, obviously I have to mean something if these people are giving me this or whatnot or whatever, and then you like lose that meaning where it's like you become trivial and like the people who are taking care of you become trivial, and now it's like you keep going with it because you put so much effort into it already, like you're biased towards it. But yeah, that's just one of the factors. There's a type of man who has great contempt for immediacy, who tries to cultivate his interiority, base his pride on something deeper and inner, create a distance between himself and the average man. Kierkegaard calls this type of man the introvert. He is a little more concerned with what it means to be a person, with individuality and uniqueness. He enjoys solitude and withdraws periodically to reflect, perhaps to nurse ideas about his secret self, what it might be. I am not saying that Kierkegaard's introvert keeps this inner quest fully alive or conscious, only that it represents somewhat more of a dimly aware problem than it does with a swallowed-up immediate man. Kierkegaard's introvert feels that he is something different from the world, has something in himself that the world cannot reflect, cannot in its immediacy and shallowness appreciate. And so he holds himself somewhat apart from that world, but not too much, not completely. It would be so nice to be the self he wants to be, to realize his vocation, his authentic talent. But it is dangerous. It might upset this world it might upset his world completely. He is, after all, basically weak, in a position of compromise. Not an immediate man, but not a real man either, even though he gives the appearance of it. I like this breaking down of because like I'm an introvert as well, but I don't, when I say stuff like that, like I don't consider myself part of like the group. Like if when you say, like, typically when you say I'm an introvert, it's like all the memes apply to you. This, and that. It's more of like, when I say it, I mean, like, I have introverted tendencies. It's not like I identify myself as an introvert and I base my personality around that aspect of my identity. But yeah, basically, if you think you're special because you're an introvert, like he says, you might be a little more concerned with what it means to be a person, but there's still just as many traps laying for you as well. So yeah. Kierkegaard describes him. Outwardly, he is completely a real man. He is a university man, husband and father, an uncommonly competent civil functionary even, a respectable father, very gentle to his wife, and carefulness itself with respect to his children. And a Christian? Well, yes, he is that too after a sort. However, he preferably avoids talking on the subject. He very seldom goes to church, because it seems to him that most parsons really don't know what they are talking about. He makes an exception in the case of one particular priest of whom he concedes that he knows what he is talking about, but he doesn't want to hear him for another reason, because he has a fear that this might lead him too far. Too far because he does not really want to push the problem of his uniqueness to any total confrontation. That which, as a husband, makes him so gentle and as a father so careful is, apart from his good-natured and his sense of duty, the admission he has made to himself in his most inward reserve concerning his weakness. And so he lives in a kind of incognito, content to toy, in his periodic solitudes, with the idea of who he might really be, content to insist on a little difference, to pride himself on a vaguely felt superiority. And this is the trap of mediocrity, I guess, is what I would call it. And this brings us to our final type of man, the one who asserts himself out of defiance of his own weakness, who tries to be a god unto himself, the master of his fate, a self-created man. He will not be merely the pawn of others, of society. He will not be a passive sufferer and a secret dreamer, nursing his own inner flame in oblivion. He will plunge into life, into the distractions of great undertakings. He will become a restless spirit, which wants to forget, or he will seek forgetfulness in sensuality, perhaps in debauchery. At its extreme, defiant self-creation can become demonic, a passion which Kierkegaard calls demoniac rage, an attack on all of life for what it has dared to do to one, a revolt against existence itself. I would say with everything, if you take anything to an extreme, it can become demonic. But yeah. This is another one where it's like the modern day nihilist who is like salty about his situation or whatever. Like, it's just funny. In our time, we would have no trouble recognizing these forms of defiant self-creation. We can see their effects so clearly on both personal and social levels. We are witness to the new cult of sensuality that seems to be repeating the sexual naturalism of the ancient Roman world. So like I mentioned earlier, the people who are like hedonism, this and that, like, oh, you shouldn't be ashamed of your urges and desires, and you should indulge, and, you know, all this and that. Like, that's not a new thing. And it's not anything that's worked in the past, so whatever. It is a living for the day alone with a defiance of tomorrow. Sound familiar? YOLO? An immersion in the body and its immediate experiences and sensations, in the intensity of touch, swelling flesh, taste, and smell, Its aim is to deny one's lack of control over events, his powerlessness, his vagueness as a person in a mechanical world spinning into decay and death. I am not saying that this is bad, this rediscovery and reassertion of one's basic vitality as an animal. The modern world, after all, has wanted to deny the person even his own body, even his emanation from his animal center. It has wanted to make him completely a depersonalized abstraction. But man kept his ape-like body and found he could use it as a base for fleshy and hairy self-assertion. And damn the bureaucrats. The only thing that might be undignified about it is its desperate reflexivity, a defiance that is not reflective and so not completely self-possessed. This is a half stamp of disapproval, where he's like saying, I'm not saying that this is bad. The only thing that's bad about it is it's reflexive, where it's not entirely like conscious control. It's more of like a reflexive, like, outpouring. But yeah. I don't see how, even if it was reflective and completely self-possessed, first of all, I don't see how someone... I just don't see how it could be. Because if you are reflecting and if you are fully self-possessed, like, you wouldn't... I don't think you would... I guess you could. It's always a mistake. But, like, just, like, completely indulging in materialistic pleasure, I don't know. I feel like if you do that, you're either not fully being, like, reflective or you're not fully self-possessed. But that's just my opinion. I don't see how whatever. Continuing on. Socially, too, we have seen a defiant Prometheanism that is basically innocuous. The confident power that can catapult man to the moon and free him somewhat of his complete dependence and confinement on Earth. At least in his imagination. The ugly side of this Prometheanism is that it, too, is thoughtless, an empty-headed immersion in the delights of technics with no thought to goals or meaning. Someone needs to tell fucking Musk this shit. God damn it. I hate people's, like, idols nowadays. Elon Musk, Neil deGrasse Tyson, fucking Bill Nye, fucking who, I don't know, Michio Kaku. I'm like 50-50 on him, but, like, most of these fucking people, it's like getting mad that water is wet and the sky is blue, but, like, I just don't... Idiots are gonna worship idiots, I guess. But yeah. So man performs on the moon by hitting golf balls that do not swerve in the lack of atmosphere. The technical triumph of a versatile ape, as the makers of the film 2001 so chillingly conveyed to us. On more ominous levels, as we shall develop later on, modern man's defiance of accident, evil, and death takes the form of skyrocketing production of consumer and military goods. Carried to its demonic extreme, this defiance gave us Hitler in Vietnam, a rage against our impotence, a defiance of our animal condition, our pathetic creature limitations. If we don't have the omnipotence of gods, we can at least destroy like gods. So yeah, just another cope. I just think it's really funny. And now we'll go into the neurotic cope. Neurosis has three interdependent aspects. In the first place, it refers to people who are having trouble living with the truth of existence. It is universal in this sense because everybody has some trouble living with the truth of life and pays some vital ransom to that truth. In the second place, neurosis is private because each person fashions his own peculiar stylistic reaction to life. Finally, beyond both of these is perhaps the unique gift of Rank's work, that neurosis is also historical to a large extent, because all the traditional ideologies that disguised and absorbed it have fallen away and modern ideologies are just too thin to contain it. When we say neurosis represents the truth of life, we again mean that life is an overwhelming problem for an animal free of instinct. The individual has to protect himself against the world, and he can do this only as any other animal would, by narrowing down the world, shutting off experience, developing an obliviousness both to the terrors of the world and to his own anxieties. Otherwise, he would be crippled for action. We cannot repeat too often the great lesson of Freudian psychology, that repression is normal self-protection and creative self-restriction. In a real sense, man's natural substitute for instinct. Rank has a perfect key term for this natural human talent. He calls it partialization and very rightly sees that life is impossible without it. What we call the well-adjusted man has just this capacity to partialize the world for comfortable action. I have used the term fetishization, which is exactly the same which is exactly the same idea. The normal man bites off what he can chew and digest of life, and no more. In other words, men aren't built to be gods, to take in the whole world. They are built like other creatures, to take in the piece of the ground in front of their noses. Gods can take in the whole of creation because they alone can make sense of it, know what it is all about and for. But as soon as a man lifts his nose from the ground and starts sniffing at eternal problems like life and death, the meaning of a rose or a star cluster, then he is in trouble. Most men spare themselves this trouble by keeping their minds on the small problems of their lives, just as their society maps these problems out for them. These are what Kierkegaard called the immediate men and the Philistines. They tranquilize themselves with the trivial, and so they can lead normal lives. I feel like all my life I've had my nose lifted from the ground and I've been sniffing at these existential problems. It's what first got me into philosophy. I started reading it in like 11th grade, but I'm pretty sure I've been reading stuff like that since like middle school, basically. But yeah. Right away, we can see the immensely fertile horizon that opens up in all of our thinking on mental health and normal behavior. In order to function normally, man has to achieve from the beginning a serious constriction of the world and of himself. We can say that the essence of normality is the refusal of reality. What we call neurosis enters precisely at this point. Some people have more trouble with their lies than others. The world is too much with them, and the techniques that they have developed for holding it at bay and cutting it down to size finally begin to choke the person himself. This is neurosis in a nutshell, the miscarriage of clumsy lies about reality. But we can also see at once that there is no line between normal and neurotic, as we all lie and are all bound in some ways by the lies. Neurosis is, then, something we all share. It is universal. Or, putting it another way, normality is neurosis and vice versa. We call a man neurotic when his lie begins to show damaging effects on him or on people around him, and he seeks clinical help for it, or others seek it for him. Otherwise, we call the refusal of reality normal because it doesn't occasion any visible problems. It is really as simple as that. After all, if someone who lives alone wants to get out of bed a half dozen times to see if the door is really locked, or another washes and dries his hands exactly 3 times every time, or uses a half roll of toilet tissue each time he relieves himself, there is really no human problem involved. These people are earning their safety in the face of the reality of creatureliness in a relatively innocuous and untroublesome ways. But the whole thing becomes more complex when we see how the lies about reality begin to miscarry. Then we have to begin to apply the label neurotic. And there are any number of occasions for this, from many ranges of human experience. Generally speaking, we call neurotic any lifestyle that begins to constrict too much, that prevents free forward momentum, new choices, and growth that a person may want and need. For example, a person who is trying to find his salvation only in a love relationship, but who is being defeated by this too narrow focus, is neurotic. I feel personally attacked. Nah, I worked through that. But yeah, he can become overly passive and dependent, fearful of venturing out onto his own, of making his life without his partner, no matter how that partner treats him. The object has become his all, his whole world, and he is reduced to the status of a simple reflex of another human being. More sensational are those other familiar miscarriages of lies about reality, what we call obsessions and compulsions, phobias of all kinds. Here we see the results of too much fetishization or partialization, too much narrowing down of the world for action. The result is that the person gets stuck in the narrowness. It is one thing to ritually wash one's hands 3 times. It is another to wash them until the hands bleed and one is in the bathroom most of the day. Here we see in pure culture, as it were, what is at stake in all human repression: the fear of life and death. Safety in the face of the real terror of creature existence is becoming a real problem for the person. He feels vulnerable, which is the truth, but he reacts too totally, too inflexibly. He fears going out in the streets, or up in elevators, or in transportation of any kind. At this extreme, it is as though the person says to himself, "If I do anything at all, I will die." We can see that the symptom is an attempt to live, an attempt to unblock action and keep the world safe. The fear of life and death is encapsulated in the symptom. If you feel vulnerable, it is because you feel bad and inferior, not big or strong enough to face up to the terrors of the universe. You work out your need for perfection, bigness, and vulnerability in the symptom, say, hand-washing or the avoidance of sex in marriage. We might say that the symptom itself represents the locus of the performance of heroism. No wonder that one cannot give it up. That would release, all by itself, the whole flood of terror that one is trying to deny and overcome. When you put all your eggs in one basket, you must clutch that basket for dear life. It is as though one were to take the whole world and fuse it into a single object or a single fear. We immediately recognize this as the same creative dynamic that the person uses in transference, when he fuses all the terror and majesty of creation in the transference object. This is what Rank meant when he said that neurosis represents creative power gone astray and confused. The ironic thing about the narrowing down of neurosis is that the person seeks to avoid death, but he does it by killing off so much of himself and so large a spectrum of his action worlds that he is actually isolating and diminishing himself and becomes as though dead. There is just no way for the living creature to avoid life and death, and it is probably poetic justice that if he tries too hard to do so, he destroys himself. It is poetic. Another way of approaching neurosis is from the opposite end of the problem. There is a type of person who has difficulty fetishizing and narrowing down. He has a vivid imagination, takes in too much experience, too large a chunk of the world. And this too must be called neurotic. We said that partializing the world is biting off what an animal can chew. Not to have this talent means constantly biting off more than one can chew. Rank puts it this way. The neurotic type makes the reality surrounding him a part of his ego, which explains his painful relation to it. For all outside processes, however, For all outside processes, however unmeaningful they may be in themselves, finally concern him. He is bound up in a kind of magic unity with the wholeness of life around him much more than the adjusted type who can be satisfied with the role of a part within the whole. The neurotic type has taken into himself potentially the whole of reality. It may seem it may seem courageous to take in the whole world, instead of just biting off pieces and acting on them. But as Rank points out, this is also precisely a defense against engagement in it. This apparent egocentricity originally is just a defense mechanism against the danger of reality. The neurotic seeks to complete his ego constantly, without paying for it. To live is to engage in experience at least partly on the terms of the experience itself. One has to stick his neck out in the action without any guarantees about satisfaction or safety. One never knows how it will come out or how silly he will look, but the neurotic type wants these guarantees. He doesn't want to risk his self-image. Rank calls this aptly the self-willed overvaluation of self, whereby the neurotic tries to cheat nature. He won't pay the price that nature wants of him, to age, fall ill, or be injured and die. Instead of living experience, he ideates it. Instead of arranging it in action, he works it all out in his head. Oh. Another personal tag. Let's go. Now we can see how the problem of neurosis can be laid out along the lines of the twin ontological motives. On the one hand, one merges with the world around him and becomes too much a part of it, and so loses his own claim to life. On the other hand, one cuts oneself off from the world in order to make one's own complete claim, and so loses the ability to live and act in the world on its terms. As Rank put it, some individuals are unable to separate and others are unable to unite. The ideal, of course, is to find some balance between the two motives, everything in moderation, right? Such as characterize the better adjusted person. He is at ease with both. The neurotic represents precisely an extreme at one end or the other. He feels that one or the other is a burden. We can see that neurosis is par excellence the danger of a symbolic animal whose body is a problem to him. Instead of living biologically, then, he lives symbolically. Instead of living in the part way that nature provided for, he lives in the total way that made possible by symbols. One substitutes the magical, all-inclusive world of the self for the real, fragmentary world of experience. Again, in this sense, everyone is neurotic, as everyone holds back from life in some ways and lets his symbolic worldview arrange things. This is what cultural morality is for. In this sense, too, the artist is the most neurotic because he too takes in the world as a totality and makes a largely symbolic problem out of it. If this neurosis characterizes everyone to a certain extent, and the artist most of all, where do we cross the line into neurosis as a clinical problem? One way, as we saw, is by the production of a crippling symptom or a too constricting lifestyle. The person has tried to cheat nature by restricting his experience, but he remains sensitive to the terror of life at some level of his awareness. Besides, he can't arrange his triumph over life and death in his mind or in his narrow heroics without paying some price, the symptom or a bogging down in guilt and futility because of an unlived life. A second way of crossing the line into clinical neurosis follows naturally from everything we have said. Rank asked why the artist so often avoids clinical neurosis when he is so much a candidate for it because of his vivid imagination, his openness to the finest and broadest aspects of experience, his isolation from the cultural worldview that satisfies everyone else. The answer is that he takes in the world, but instead of being oppressed by it, he reworks it in his own personality and recreates it in the work of art. The neurotic is precisely the one who cannot create, the artiste manqué, as Rank so aptly calls him. We might say that both the artist and the neurotic bite off more than they can chew, but the artist spews it back out again and chews it over in an objectified way, as an external, active work project. The neurotic can't marshal this creative response embodied in a specific work, and so he chokes on his introversions. The artist has similar large-scale introversions, but he uses them as material. The neurotic exhausts himself not only in self-preoccupations like hypochondriacal fears and all sorts of fantasies, but also in others. Those around him on whom he is dependent become his therapeutic work project. He takes out his subjective problems on them. But people are not clay to be molded. They have needs and counterwills of their own. The neurotic's frustration as a failed artist can't be remedied by anything but an objective creative work of his own. And I don't know if I fully agree with that, but it makes a hell of a lot of sense. This is when we get into part 3, we're going to talk about Ranke's artistic solution, which this is kind of an intro of, and Kierkegaard's religious solution, which I'm not sure if I've mentioned yet or not. But anyways, yeah. The difference between an artist and a neurotic is the artist actually, transmutes it into art. It's being... what would it be? This relation to the world, this the inherent suffering and unbearability of it becomes bearable through art. So yeah, like I said, this is an introduction of it. Another way of looking at it is to say that the more totally one takes in the world as a problem, the more inferior or bad one is going to feel inside oneself. He can try to work out this badness by striving for perfection, and then the neurotic symptom becomes his creative work. Or he can try to make himself perfect by means of his partner. But it's obvious to us that the only way to work on perfection is in the form of an objective work that is fully under your control and is perfectible in some real ways. Either you eat up yourself and others around you trying for perfection, or you objectify that imperfection in a work, on which you then unleash your creative powers. In this sense, some kind of objective creativity is the only answer man has to the problem of life. I wouldn't say it's the only one, but it is a key one. In this way, he satisfies nature, which asks that he live and act objectively as a vital animal plunging into the world. But he also satisfies his own distinctive human nature because he plunges in on his own symbolic terms, and not as a reflex of the world as given to mere sense experience. He takes in the world, makes a total problem out of it, and then gives out a fashioned human answer to that problem. This, as Goethe saw in Faust, is the highest that man can achieve. And so if you're paying close attention, you'll realize this artistic solution actually satisfies both ontological motives. In a balanced way as well. Let's see. The Eros, it obviously it satisfies the Eros. Let me think about how it satisfies agape, where it's because agape is the merger with the one. I would say the getting into the flow state, the creative process, I would say that's probably where your agape ontological motive is satisfied. It's you are you're losing yourself in the creativity and the creation, almost, if that makes sense. But at the same time, you're also individuating yourself as a creator through artistic expression. Yeah. From this point of view, the difference between the artist and the neurotic seems to boil down largely to a question of talent. It is like the difference between an illiterate schizophrenic and a Strindberg. One ends up on the backwards and the other becomes a culture hero. But both experience the world in similar ways, and only the quality and power of the reaction differ. If the neurotic feels vulnerable in the face of the world he takes in, he reacts by criticizing himself to excess. He can't endure himself or the isolation that his individuality plunges him into. On the other hand, he still needs to be a hero, still needs to earn immortality on the basis of his unique qualities, which means that he still must glorify himself in some ways. But he can glorify himself only in fantasy, as he cannot fashion a creative work that speaks on his behalf by virtue of its objective perfection. He is caught in a vicious circle because he experiences the unreality of fancied self-glorification. There is really no conviction possible for a man unless it comes from others or from outside himself in some way, at least not for long. One simply cannot justify his own heroism in his own inner symbolic fantasy, which is what leads the neurotic to feel more unworthy and inferior. The artist, on the other hand, overcomes his inferiority and glorifies himself because he has the talent to do so. And I don't want to get into the whole, talent is what you're born with and skill is what you're, like, it doesn't matter. Like, you can put in the skill to anything and develop the same thing. And it doesn't have to be art either. One thing I always think of is Japanese chefs, sushi chefs. What do they do? The hibachi grillers, like that, level of technical skill and artistry that you have with that job, even though it's not art, it's still a form of this same artistic solution. From all this, we can see how interchangeably we can talk about neurosis, adolescence, normality, the artist, with only varying degrees of difference, or with a peculiar additive like talents making all the difference. Talent itself is usually largely circumstantial, the result of luck and work, which makes Rank's view of neurosis true to life. Artists are neurotic as well as creative. The greatest of them can have crippling neurotic symptoms and can cripple those around them as well by their neurotic demands and needs. There is no doubt that creative work is itself done under a compulsion, often indistinguishable from a purely clinical obsession. In this sense, what we call a creative gift is merely the social license to be obsessed. Yep. The better the creative genius, the crazier the person is. Generally. And what we call cultural routine is a similar license. The proletariat demands the obsession of work in order to keep from going crazy. I used to wonder how people could stand the really demonic activity of working behind those hellish ranges in hotel kitchens, the frantic whirl of waiting on a dozen tables at one time. I used to do that all the time. The madness of the travel agent's office at the height of the tourist season, or the torture of working with a jackhammer all day on a hot summer street. The answer is so simple that it eludes us. The craziness of these activities is exactly that of the human condition. They are right for us because the alternative is natural desperation. The daily madness of these jobs is a repeated vaccination to their compulsive routines. Look at the joy and eagerness with which workers return from vacation to their compulsive routines. They plunge into their work with equanimity and lightheartedness because it drowns out something more ominous. Men have to be protected from reality, all of which poses another gigantic problem to a sophisticated Marxism, namely, what is the nature of the obsessive denials of reality that a utopian society will provide to keep men from going mad? I've mentioned utopias before and how they wouldn't last. But yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's I like how conservatives are always like, oh, if you give everybody universal basic income, no one will want to work. It's like, no, they absolutely would. Like, people still need a distraction from. I was reading Schopenhauer's Wisdom of Life. I think that was Schopenhauer, where he talks about the two. It's either boredom or I forget the other one. But basically, it's like if boredom is one of the one of the worst damn, I'll just have to go look at it again. Yeah, I'll have to go look at it again. But yeah, basically, yeah. I just think it's funny. No one will want to work if you give everybody free money. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. I'm sure, like, I'm not doubting at all the fact that there probably are people who won't work if they're given free money, but, like, that's not gonna be everybody. It might not even be a majority of the people. Anyways. And so, the question for the science of mental health must become an absolutely new and revolutionary one, yet one that reflects the essence of the human condition. On what level of illusion does one live? We must remind ourselves that when we talk about the need for illusion, we are not being cynical. True, there is a great deal of falseness and self-deception in the cultural causa sui project. But there is also the necessity of this project. Man needs a second world, a world of humanly created meaning, a new reality that he can live, dramatize, nourish himself in. Illusion means creative play at its highest level. Now he talks, like, he discounts Kierkegaard's religious solution because he's not, I'm not sure if he's atheistic, but, like, he recognizes that that solution isn't going to work for some people. So he, like, tries to be secular about it. And, like, he'll so say stuff like illusion is necessary. It's like, no, if you really, like, dig, like, into all this, like, there is a second world, but it's not humanly created meaning. Like, there is a true, like, the kingdom of heaven is within you type shit. Like, it's I don't know. Like, he's gonna write it off as, like, it needs, like, it's an illusion that needs to be built, but it's like, it's not an illusion. But yeah. So yeah, illusion means creative play at its highest level. Cultural illusion is a necessary ideology of self-justification, a heroic dimension that is life itself to the symbolic animal. To lose the security of heroic cultural illusion is to die. That is what deculturation of primitives means and what it does. It kills them or reduces them to the animal level of chronic fighting and fornication. Life becomes possible only in a continual alcoholic stupor. Many of the older American Indians were relieved when the big chiefs in Ottawa and Washington took control and prevented them from warring and feuding. It was a relief from the constant anxiety of death for their loved ones, if not for themselves. But they also knew, with a heavy heart, that this eclipse of their traditional hero systems at the same time left them as good as dead. It's something to think about. And we have made it through part 2. Finally, we will be finishing up with part 3. Modern problems require ancient solutions. That'll be the next video. Again, I apologize for being so late on all this, but I do have videos in line. This one's just about ready for me to record. And then I'm still doing, I still got it way back from October, man. That's crazy. I still got to do my poetry videos, my haikus, October, November, December, even though I know none of y'all watch it, even though there's some good shit in there. But yeah. So yeah, those will be up. Part 3 is going to be up. I think, I might do part 3 all in one video, maybe. We'll see. But yeah. I do have some other stuff in line. I had some stuff like that. I had some extra like content to record that I was gonna give y'all on Christmas, but of course that never worked out, so I'm just gonna give it to y'all this month. But yeah, I will see y'all next time. Y'all take it easy. Later.